And the recording is now started, so we'll jump right in. This session is on programming of TYT DMR handhelds, the MD-380 and 390, and the MD-UV380 and 390, like this. My name is Mason Fewer, call sign KF7HVM here in Longview, Washington, and you can go to my website here, kf7hvm.com, for the slides and written instructions and links to the software that I'm about to mention. All right, so these are the models we're talking about. Over here on the left, we got the old school MD-380 and 390. While they look similar, the one on the left is monoband. There's a VHF and UHF version. So if you're buying one used or something, make sure you know what frequency range it's on. These support up to 1,000 channels, 10,000 contacts, 250 SCANLIST and zones. And the zones over here can have 16 channels each. The one on the left, the monoband one, has custom firmware written for it, and the newer ones do not. So you're stuck on the stock firmware if you go with the UV380. The UV380 is dual band, and it also supports transmit in the commercial range. So it's a Part 90 radio. You could talk in the unlicensed spectrum, FRS, GMRS, MERS, as well as business frequencies. It will hold 3,000 channels and 10,000 contacts, or 120,000 if you install TYT's official contact CSV firmware. We'll talk about that later. Same number of SCANLISTs and zones, but the MD-UV380 supports 64 channels each in a SCANLIST or a zone, which is considerably more flexible for programming. Additionally, the zones on the UV380 have an A and a B, so you get 64 channels on each side. And you see on the display down here, there's a top and bottom. You can actually dual watch on the UV380. If you're buying one of these today, I would definitely recommend getting the MD-UV380 just because it's a much more capable radio. The only difference between the 380 and the 390 is the 390 variants have GPS, and I have a little star down here because I don't think it's that useful. It's built-in GPS, you can get your position, but this is really designed with a commercial dispatch setting in mind. So the GPS can be transmitted to the repeater, but the amateur repeaters don't support that. It's not really well supported, and there's no APRS. So from a ham radio perspective, the GPS does not really buy you much in these handhelds. Any questions on the hardware?
How much do they each cost?
That's actually interesting. They're about the same price, which is why I recommend the UV380. You could have each one for about $85 to $100, depending on who you buy it from. And yeah, it's kind of weird that there's not a more of a price differential between them when the UV380 is such a more powerful radio. All right, this is a topic on programming, so. All right, somebody's coming in on the repeater. So the stock software is really similar to the other Chinese manufacturers that you see out there, the Baofangs, the Retevis, the, what's the other one? I can't remember the name, but a lot of these, I'm pretty sure there's some software vendor that makes the same CPS for all these different radios. And so while they look the same, they all work kind of different. And with the stock software, it's basically an entire different program for each model. So the UV380 is a different program than the MD380. I think it supports the 390 variants, but it is, it's very different. It won't work between the two. The stock software is very limited functionality. You can't reorder zones. You can't import and export zones or scan lists. And to import the contact list, you actually have to buy a licensed copy of Microsoft Excel. So this talk, I'm not actually going to be going over the stock software. We're going to be using a third-party CPS that I recommend to do the programming here. This is also Windows only, and there's some like annoying bugs in it. Like if you're tabbing through the fields, like it doesn't go in order. So it's just not fun to use. As Matt can attest, the stock software it's not useful. So what will we use instead? This is what it's called, EDITCP. I'm trying to get rid of my videos here. And EDITCP is written by Dale Farnsworth. It is open source. It runs on Windows and Linux, and it attempts to replicate the UI of the stock CPS while giving you a lot better user experience. It's got drag and drop. It supports multiple radios in the same software package. You could import and export the entire code plug as JSON, which is really nice if you are a programmer and want to write code to manipulate your code plug. Having that in JSON is much nicer. It'll also do data validation for you. So before you upload it to your radio, you can click validate fields, and it'll let you know if you're about to upload a code plug that has missing references or isn't going to work. It has identical field names, and they're in the same spot. So if you're switching between EDITCP and the stock CPS, it's going to feel similar. The stuff's going to be in the same spot. You don't have to learn two pieces of software here. Oops, wrong way. The other piece of third-party software that kind of I wanted to talk about here is the n0gsg contact manager, and it supports multiple radio types. It supports the Anytone 878 and 578 code plugs, and it does a structural import and export. So if you're using this, you could take a code plug from a completely different kind of radio and pull the channels out and convert it to a different sort of code plug without having to do a lot of manual work. The other really nice thing about n0gsg is if you're building your code plugs completely manually, not using a code plug generator, you get these nice features like channel mask change. So you can select a group of channels and then go channel mask change, and you could change the same field across all the channels. So if I wanted to extend the timeout to 90 seconds, I could check this little change timeout box, and then it would change it for all the channels. Similarly, if I was like adding a scan list or something, this makes it really easy to change multiple channels at once, which you just can't do in the stock software. It also has a zone wizard for selecting channels and dropping them in a zone and creating scan lists. So this is a good piece of software for people that manually manage their code plug. I think Rick uses this one. It's Windows only, but it will run on Linux under Wine. All right. So before I get into the settings, is there any questions on software that anybody has?
What is a code plug?
Okay, that's a good question. A code plug, in really, really layman's terms, is just the programming of your radio. It's the channels, frequencies, offsets, talk groups, everything that makes the radio useful in a particular region is going to be in the code plug. So for analog radios, they're much simpler. You don't have as many settings that you need to tweak. And so the word code plug never really came into wide use for analog radios, mainly just programming them. But in the DMR world, code plug is a pretty well understood term. And what is the actual code plug itself? You'll see right here, I have it open MD-UV380.rdt. So that is a binary file that is literally the memory representation of the programming of the radio. And that's why they're not compatible between models. And that's why we have to use tools like this to read the code plug into a format that is understandable by a human, convert it, format it how we want, and then write it out to a format that is understood by a particular radio. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did.
Excellent. Anybody else out there about software before we go on?
I have a comment.
Go ahead, Matt.
Before you mentioned that this program required a paid copy of Excel. I don't use Excel. I use a program that's, let me find it. Sorry, it was I'm waiting for it to open.
Sure.
It's another Excel file. I'm sorry, my computer's not pulling up with it. Just
Is it LibreOffice?
yes, that's it. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah, so I've tried that and it doesn't work.
Okay.
This program was specifically designed to use some DLL that's provided by Excel. And it works for the
Okay.
most part. You can use it without Excel, but if you want to import the contact database, that requires a licensed copy of Excel.
Now, Mason, isn't the whole point though that if you have EDITCP and oh shoot, what was the other one that lets you do the editing of the code plug manager? Yeah, sorry, the n0gsg. Then you don't need to worry about that at all, right?
Affirmative. Yeah.
Okay,
The
right.
this tool and the previous one, EDITCP, they will upload the contact database and they do not require Excel.
Got it. Cool.
And it's the main reason why this talk is not going to talk about the stock CPS at all. I just don't even think it's worth using. I don't know if that's a controversial statement, if anybody wants to contend that.
I couldn't figure it out after the few minutes I threw at it, so I'm good.
All right, let's jump in then. I'll talk about the general settings that we have access to. And I'm showing the UV380 here because there's more settings available. The MD-80 has the same important settings, but some of the newer stuff that was recently added is not in there. So if you're using a MD-380, you won't have some of this like group call match, and you won't have the frequency channel mode, stuff like that. But the important stuff is all there. And the important stuff is the radio name. So that's where you put in your call sign. The radio ID. Can you guys see my mouse pointer when I move that?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Let me get the laser. It's a little easier to see. Okay, so for the radio ID, that's where you put in your DMR number. So you'd register for that on radioid.net and upload your license. Once you get that ID, you put it in that box. Worth noting, on these radios, the scan hang time is actually a general setting. So it's not configurable per scan list. But what this hang time is when you're scanning, if it stops on a channel with activity, it's going to wait for this many milliseconds before continuing the scan. Talk permit tone is something that is of particular interest to DMR operators, because when you key up on DMR, your radio is actually doing a little negotiation with the repeater, and the repeater will send you a signal when it's okay to begin speaking. So if you turn on talk permit tone, your radio will emit a little beep once it gets that signal, and you'll know it's okay to start your transmission. And the last one I wanted to point out here, this is a UV380 only thing, is the enable contacts CSV. It's a general setting. And if you turn that on, that will open the radio up to 120,000 contacts in the database. All right. Any questions on the settings before I move on to the programming part? Okay. So manual programming, the old idiom, give a man a code plug and he operates for a day. Teach a man to code plug and he operates for a lifetime. And this is not meant to be exclusionary. I mean, this is the idiom version of man referring to human. You are definitely included here. So what are we programming in DMR? Kind of started this list from the first things you think about, and it goes down to the last things you think about. So when you're programming DMR, you first create your contacts, and those are also called digital contacts or talk groups. Basically what we're doing here is we're taking a DMR ID number and we're mapping it to a name. We have group lists, and that's basically a list of those contacts, which will all be heard on a specific channel. I'm going to go into all these in detail after this slide. This is just the intro. We have channels. So it's going to be digital or analog, and it's basically a frequency, an offset, color code, which is a DMR-ish PL tone. Channel has a TX contact, so that is what talk group you're going to be transmitting on when you key up. A channel also has an RX list. So this is what I was talking about here with the group list. So a specific channel will have a list of talk groups which can be heard on that channel. There's a scan list and a zone. These are pretty similar. They're just groupings of channels. So a scan list is for scanning a group of channels, and a zone is for scrolling through with the little wheel on the top to select a channel. I'm not really sure why they're separate, and it's kind of annoying sometimes because if you want to scan, you have to create separate scan lists, even though you already have a zone. It's kind of how the radio is designed. I think it's been mentioned before, but this is really a radio that was intended for the commercial market, and due to its price point, the hams have kind of gotten a hold of it and figured out how to make it work for amateur radio use. There's still some wrinkles in there. So if we're going to program a brand new radio, we start with the contacts. So using the EDITCP software, you open a new code plug, and there's a little button on the side that says contacts, and that will give you this screen here. And you can see I've entered a couple of contacts, and what a contact is a name and an ID number. If it's a talk group, the call type is group. We don't really use private call that much, but it can map call signs to DMR IDs if you don't have the custom firmware on the MD-380, or if you're not using the contact CSV feature, then you could put call sign to DMR ID mappings in here as private calls, and they would still show up when that person, when your radio is receiving a transmission from that ID, you would see the call sign instead of the number, which is really nice. Those numbers mean nothing to most people, so it's good to have the name in there. Thanks, Mike, for stopping by. All right, so once we put our contacts in, and normally, you know, if you're programming a whole repeater, you would put in every talk group that was covered on that repeater. I just put in 2 for this example because it's kind of a lot of work to type them all in by hand, and we'll get to that at the end. Okay, so first channel I'm going to make is a digital simplex channel. So if I go over to my code plug channels button, this is what I get. And over on the left is a list of channels. And when I click on the channel, it's going to show the details over here in the right pane. So this box in the upper left, these are common settings. It's not the best UI because some of them only apply to analog, even though they're in the shared section. But since this is a digital channel, I go up to channel mode and I select digital. And I'm making a simplex channel, so I'm going to use the 446.5 well-known DMR simplex frequency. I enter a name for it, and I enter the frequency. And for simplex, I set admit criteria to always because you don't really have color codes and stuff. So what that means is no matter what traffic is on that frequency, if you hit that PTT, your radio is going to start transmitting. It's generally considered impolite mode if you're operating on repeaters, but if you're operating simplex or with a hotspot, it makes more sense to not prevent you from transmitting. So those are the main important bits over here. And for digital channels, this pane on the right gets activated, and we can enter some digital specific stuff. Like I said, these are commercial radios, so they have encryption, they have emergency dispatch settings and stuff like that. For amateur use, you turn all that off. So don't do any confirmations, turn off all emergency stuff, set emergency system to none. Like down here, privacy, set that to none. Just, especially, it's not going to do anything, but if you're operating on repeaters, it could disrupt the network for other users. So anything that you don't know what it does is probably a good idea to turn off. The important bits that I have over here on this side is contact name. So this is the transmit contact. When you push that PTT button on this channel, this talk group is going to be associated with your traffic. So in this case, it is a simplex, DMR simplex. Everybody uses 99 for that, so that's why I've used that here. Additionally, for simplex, color code 1, repeater slot 1 is the norm. And if everybody uses the same conventions, then we can talk to each other on simplex, which is nice. All right, before I go on to repeaters, is there any questions about anything on this screen or anything regarding DMR simplex in general?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Could you define P2P simplex? Is that point to point? Just
Point to point.
simplex? Okay.
Yeah, so you'd use the similar setup if you were talking to a simplex hotspot or if you were talking radio to radio.
Okay. That after I said it out loud, it made sense. Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to the next section. And that is the group list. Group lists, I would say, very useful and maybe not really understood or used by a lot of folks that are manually programming their radio. Essentially, a group list will let a single channel monitor multiple talk groups. So in our world, and I'll get to it a little later, you pretty much have a channel for every talk group on the repeater that you want to transmit on. And some people set this up in a scan list, so they scan all the talk groups. But that takes a long time and is not really necessary. And it cycles the tuner on the radio so much that you might actually miss calls because you're changing the channel frequently. So what a group list allows you to do is receive traffic for multiple talk groups on a single channel. Since channels are restricted to time slot on the TYT, it really only makes sense to have a group list with talk groups that are all in the same time slot. So in this example, what I've done here is I've made a RX group list called PNW Digital TS1. So for time slot 1, and then I've moved the time slot 1 contacts that I created over to it. So I have Oregon 1 over here and Washington 1. What that means is any channel that has PNW Digital TS1 as the RX list will hear traffic on Oregon 1 and Washington 1, even if that's not the TX contact. So why would you want to do this? I already mentioned it can make scanning faster. You'll miss less calls, but it'll also help you avoid stealing the time slot away from an ongoing QSO. So if I, for example, wanted to make a transmission on Oregon 1, but somebody was already using time slot 1 to talk on Washington 1, unless I had this set up, I might not even know that somebody else was carrying on a different talk group. And if I keyed up on Oregon 1, I would take over their QSO and potentially interrupt it. So it's just a politeness thing. Also, from an amateur radio perspective, I kind of like to hear everything. So I set up these group lists so that regardless of what channel I'm on, I'm hearing all the traffic on the repeater. So what I advise here is you put all the time slot 1 talk groups in a list and all the time slot 2 talk groups in another list. And then when you're making the channels, which I'll get to on the next step, if it's a TS1 channel, you'd put it on the TS1 group list. If it's a TS2 channel, you'd put it on the TS2 group list. Maybe that makes sense. Any questions on that one?
So maybe this is evident to everyone who already plays the DMR a lot. So if you have one of these groups and you've got all the time slot 1 frequencies in there, all those channels kind of merged together, is that right? So you're receiving and you could be hearing multiple channels through one channel in effect. Is that sort of the idea?
Well, I want to get really pedantic on terminology
Sure.
because it is important. So these are contacts. A contact just maps a DMR ID to a name.
Okay.
A channel is a frequency and an offset and a TX contact. So a channel is actually what you would key up on or listen on. So when you set up
The
a
memory and
group
radio.
list, go ahead.
Sorry, you're talking like the memories in the radio when you have like the slot. Okay, gotcha. Keep going.
Yeah. So if I make my channel for organ 1 on a particular repeater, and I set my receive group list to PNW Digital TS1, if that frequency picks up traffic from either Oregon 1 or Washington 1, my squelch is going to open up. I'm going to hear the traffic, and I'm also going to see the ID of the talk group it was associated with.
So you see the ID, and that's how you can know if you're stepping on someone's toes, like you were saying.
Right.
Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying.
And the other thing about DMR, I'll mention it here since it kind of came up tangentially. If you're putting a call out on a talk group, it is a good idea to also announce the talk group name and number. That way, if somebody has a configuration like this, where they're hearing all traffic or they're in promiscuous mode and they're hearing everything and they're across the room, they'll know which talk group to go on to talk back to you. Otherwise, you have to go look at call watch or something and see what talk group the person was on. It's more of a hassle.
Comment.
Go ahead, comment.
Sean, are you familiar with time slots? I don't know by your comments, I don't know if you understood time slots and how they work. And if Mason wants to cover that, if you don't understand, that would work.
I mean, I know at a high frequency, high theoretical level, I mean, that's used as, cellular phones and a lot of public service radios. I mean, I don't know at the low level DMR precisely, but, just like TDMA and those kinds of algorithms, I think I get the gist of it for this context, but feel free if that's part of what you want to dive into, that's cool too.
I got another presentation that's DMR basics, so I don't have it in this talk, and it's kind of out of scope for programming TYTs, but we could talk about it later after I get through this content if you like. All right, so this is kind of where it starts coming together. Defining digital repeaters. So I probably at this point should share my browser as well. Let's see, and I will go to pnwdigital.net. And if you're not aware, this is the regional DMR network, a lot of repeaters on here. And I go look at the talk group picker. So for my examples, I'm going to program in the Longview Rainier Hill repeater because it's local to me and I'm most familiar with how it works. So if I want to see what talk groups are available on that repeater, I go to pnwdigital.net, technical information, system support, and talk group picker. It takes me here. And then I can pull up the repeater that I'm interested in, and it's going to show me all of the talk groups that are carried by this repeater, whether they're full-time, what the timeout timers are. And if you're programming manually, this kind of information is absolutely what you need to make the channels. So it's kind of what we're dealing with here. In this example, I'm just going to put Oregon 1 in and Washington 1, so it doesn't take all night. I'm assuming you could see the browser, right? Okay, cool. All right, so here is what it would look like for Washington 1. Similar to the SIMPLEX, the main difference here is I now have a TX offset. I've changed the admit criteria to color code. So what that means is if my radio is picking up traffic with the same color code as this channel, it's not going to let me transmit. So that prevents me from stepping on an active transmission. The other important bits are contact name. So this is the Washington 1 channel. So I set contact name to Washington 1. That means when I key up on this channel, the talk group associated with it is going to be Washington 1. And I set the RX group list to PNW Digital TS1, like I mentioned on the previous slide. What that means is if I have the radio on this channel, it will also hear traffic from Oregon 1, even though that's not the contact in place here.
Can you move the talk group deck so we can see that, please?
Like that? Is that?
Oh, I can't see the screen behind the talk group deck.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. Let's start this over here. How's that?
Very good.
Okay, great. Yeah, so the admit criteria, color code, that prevents you from stepping on somebody else on the repeater. RX group list, PNW Digital TS1, and you have to define the group list first because this is a drop down. Same with the contacts. You have to go put the contacts in there first, and then you can assign them to a channel. Repeater slot, also known as time slot. This is very important. It's either 1 or 2. So if you're using time slot 2 talk groups, then this repeater slot must be 2. And like I said before, the radio will only receive traffic on a channel on a single time slot. So whether you have time slot 1 or time slot 2 picked, regardless of what's in the RX group list, you're only going to get traffic from that same slot. Conveniently, though, this radio has an A and B, so you can put a time slot 1 on the A and a time slot 2 on the B, and then you'll hear all the traffic. What else was I going to get into? Oh, yeah. So the way these radios program, and this is probably the most confusing thing for anybody used to programming analog radios, is we need 1 channel per transmit talk group. So there's no way to change the transmit talk group from the radio. So if you want to transmit on Oregon 1 and Washington 1 and Cascades 1 and everything that's supported by the repeater, you need to basically duplicate all of these settings, change the name, and change the contact. But it's the same repeater, it's the same RX frequency, the same TX offset. You're just changing the contact name, and then when you go to that channel on the radio and key up, then it keys up on that particular contact. So this channel name is pretty arbitrary. What I like to do for channel names is I put a shortened talk group name, the time slot, and then a shortened repeater name. So in this case, LVR stands for Longview Rainier Hill, and PNW Digital kind of has those codes already in there. So I kind of follow their convention. So you can see over in the channel list on the left, I also have a channel for Oregon 1 LVR. It's set up exactly the same. The only difference is the name and the contact name. Any questions on that? This is what makes programming DMR so tedious, because for every repeater you want to use, you have to go through and copy and make multiple channels for every talk group that you want to use on it. And it's a total nightmare. It takes forever.
Comment.
Go ahead, Matt.
I have noticed the biggest learning curve between the Anytone software and the TYT software is in the TYT software, contact name means talk group in the Anytone software. Have you noticed that as well?
So in Anytone, is it called talk group?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, that's definitely more clear. That's the other thing that's kind of confusing, is each manufacturer and each CPS is going to use slightly different terminology for the same thing. That's why on the overview page I had here, there's like multiple names for all this stuff: contact, digital contact, talk group. different manufacturers, different software is going to name it different things. And so part of getting familiar with DMR is knowing what to look for, even if it's called something else. Any other comments before I talk about zones?
Is it convention that almost every DMR repeater uses both time slots? I assume they might.
Yeah, that's the DMR tier 2 is what it's technically referred to. And all of the P&W digital repeaters use both time slots, and they use them for different purposes. There's also like Brandmeister repeaters out there that conventionally will set static talk groups on time slot 1 and then allow you to pick whatever talk groups you want on time slot 2. That's called dynamic. None of the P&W digital repeaters are dynamic. You can only use the talk groups that are configured on them by the admin. So it kind of makes programming a little bit simpler because you know upfront what all is going to be supported, but it also limits you because you can't go anywhere you want. All right, I'm going to breeze through these next couple because it's taking longer than I thought. This is just programming analog channels. It works pretty much like you would expect for any analog programming software. It takes a little getting used to. The main things I wanted to point out here, bandwidth. If you switch from a digital channel to analog, it stays stuck on 12.5, and you most likely do not want to use 12.5 bandwidth unless you're specifically going on the FRS frequencies. So make sure you change that to 25, very important. And admit criteria should be always for simplex. Analog repeater, pretty much the same story. We just add an offset here. We change the admit criteria to CTCSS so that we can't transmit if there's somebody else with the same tone. And all of these signaling options down here, just leave them off. Those are just going to be annoying to people listening to the repeater. So you don't want to send ETMF tones. You don't want bursts. Just set the CTCSS encode and decode as you see fit. Okay, finally, zones. Zones are really cool because they let you group channels together, and you don't need to copy the channels. So you can have a single channel that exists in multiple zones. So they're a great organizational feature for getting around your radio, and particularly using your radio across a wide geographic area. So I have my zones set for geographies. I have like my local area, I got Portland, I got Seattle, I got the beach, and I go to those zones and it has digital and analog repeaters that are likely within range. One thing that might be kind of unusual to people coming from analog is a channel has to be in a zone if you're going to use it. So you can't just make a channel and expect it to show up. The way these radios work is you make a channel, you put it in a zone, and the radio is always in a zone. So if I turn mine on here and hold it up, I don't know if you can see that. No, the screen's too bright. Oh, there we go. It's backwards. Anyway, the zone is always displayed on the bottom, and then the two lines above that are the selected channels. This screenshot here is from a MD-380. It only has a single bank, so you get 16 channels per zone, and that's it. Kind of bites. On the UV380, you get an A and a B, and each one can have 64 channels, so a lot more flexibility there. Scan lists are really similar to zones, except instead of turning them on and picking a channel, you basically scan through all of the channels that are in there. So regardless of what zone you're in, you could scan on a totally different scan list. So they are similar but separate concepts. So I could be in my Longview Rainier Hill zone, but then I could be scanning analog repeaters. And on these radios, you actually can't scan without a scan list. So if you want to do any scanning at all, you have to make a scan list. And if you want to scan the same channels that are in a particular zone, you have to make a scan list and then put all the same channels in it. Some settings of the scan list that I wanted to highlight because I didn't know how they worked until I was preparing for this presentation. Priority channel 1 and priority channel 2. So you can pick two channels from the scan list, and these will be checked 50% of the time. So if you don't have a priority channel 2 set, if this is blank, then your priority channel 1 is going to get checked 50% of the time. If you have them both, then each one is checked 25% of the time. So that means you can have a really long scan list, and you could check two frequencies a lot more common if those ones are of more interest to you or get more traffic. TX designated channel, this will let you pick a particular channel or the selected channel or the one last received traffic. What that means is if you're scanning and you hit that PTT, that's the channel that you're going to transmit on. I usually keep this on last active channel because for scanning, it makes sense. I hear somebody when I'm scanning, and then I can immediately key up and talk back to them. Signaling hold time is not used. Priority sample time. If you're scanning and the radio stops on a frequency, the priority sample time is how frequently it's going to check your priority channels, even though you're already listening to a signal. So if you set this to a really low value, the scanned audio is going to be choppy because every half a second it's going to check the priority channel for traffic. I set it to 2 seconds. So every 2 seconds I get a minor blip. And if there's traffic on the priority, it switches from what you're listening to and takes you to the priority channel. Just some interesting scanning behavior that I think is worth mentioning here. The hold times, so when the radio stops on a channel and then the traffic goes away, how long does it wait before it starts scanning again? Those hold times are in the global settings. I mentioned them at the beginning of the presentation. Any questions on scan lists?
I just figured out it does not look like analog can commingle with that. Is that right?
Scan lists and zones will both support mixed digital and analog channels.
Oh, okay.
So in this scan list, I'm listening on digital simplex. I got 2 digital repeaters, analog, FM simplex, and then an analog repeater, and it'll scan through all of them.
Oh, it's because those are actual contacts and not channels.
No, these are channels.
Okay, I'll figure out what I'm doing. I just added just the 2 meter simplex analog as a channel. I was wondering why it didn't show up in the scan list.
So you have to make a scan list, and then it should show up in the available column, and then you can add them over to be members.
Ah, okay. I had to close and reopen, then now it's there. Sorry, man. Thank you.
All right. Any just catch-all questions about this programming? I can switch over to the program and I could show you live what it looks like if you want to see what any of these drop-downs do or anything before I talk about the next section. All right. I gotta get these videos out of here now. Starting from existing code plug. So like I said, it's a whole lot of work to put in all these contacts and talk groups and channels. And frankly, it's kind of a nightmare. And I almost didn't even get started in DMR because of what a hassle it was. That said, there are a lot of existing code plugs out there, and probably people in your local club, people that use the same repeaters that you do, will have copies of code plugs they're willing to share. However, everybody sets up their code plug different, and most of the time you just don't want to directly use somebody else's code plug because you want the names different or the order different or various tweaks. And they might be using a different radio than you, and so you can't just directly use their code plug. But what EDITCP allows you to do is open up 2 different code plugs at the same time. So over here on the left, I have my sample code plug open that just had those 3 talk groups I manually entered. And then over here on the right, I have my generated code plug that has all of the talk groups from PNW Digital and more. So I just selected all of those and I dragged them right over, and bam, now they're in my new code plug. This is really smart too, because it automatically copies dependent objects. So if you remember back when I was talking about, you got to put the contacts in first. When you're making the channel, you get it in the drop down. Well, when you drag and drop, the program will figure out what all the dependent objects are and also copy those. So with EDITCP, you can really customize your own code plug from an existing one pretty easily. The other thing I wanted to mention here is the n0gsg contact manager allows direct import of contacts and channels. So if you have a code plug from a different format radio, any format that n0gsg supports, you can import into a TYT code plug, save it out, and then open that up in EDITCP and continue customizing. So these programs kind of work together, and using n0gsg, you could essentially create a starter code plug from like an Anytone 878 and then work it into a customized TYT code plug. Okay, I'm not gonna get to that yet. Actually, yeah, I will. So the contacts database, I kind of touched on the fact that looking at numbers is hard, and that's where the contacts database comes in. The MD-380 really only supported contacts database with the custom firmware, and I'm not going to get too much into that. You could make private contacts for up to 10,000 people that you expected to hear from, but it's kind of a hassle. The MD-UV380, TYT actually released an official firmware that begins, the version number begins with a V, and that supports a feature called Contacts CSV, which lets you store up to 120,000 contacts in there. And EDITCP will actually let you upload that without any problem. So currently, I think I put 160K plus here, and then I looked, and it's like 186K as of 6:30 p.m. And it's growing. So to fit that contact list into these radios, you're gonna have to trim it down. And I've been talking about this radioid.net DB generator, and then I tried to use it and figured out they want $10 a year for it. And it doesn't seem that expensive, but I wasn't willing to pay it at this point, when the n0gsg contact manager can download and filter the list. So what does that look like? Check the chat here. Okay, AE7KJ. Thanks for coming by. So with the n0gsg contact manager, you can, even without a code plug loaded, you can pull up the online database searcher, put in some search terms. So in this case, I'm looking for DMR IDs in the United States and Canada only. And it matched 87,303, which will fit within this radio. So using this tool, I can export it and then go back over to EDITCP, and it provides the capability to upload that to the radio. I don't have a good demo here. I actually tried to do this before the presentation and I had problems. Usually I do this from Linux, so I don't know if that was part of the issue. But this is fiddly. It's definitely not turnkey, and I think you'll have to mess with it a little bit to get the database in there. Unless anybody else on the call has any suggestions. It does work. I've uploaded it before, but it's never worked turnkey. All right, what else am I dealing with here? I think I'm almost done. I think I'm almost done with my prepared content. So this brings me to the end of it. What if I don't want to do all of this work to make a code plug? And I don't blame you if you don't. People have created code plug generators to kind of take input files that are in easy to store and maintain formats and then convert them to functional code plugs that you can upload to your radio. And I think the first one I knew about was the K7ABD Anytone config builder. This will make 878 code plugs. And the P&W digital community code plugs are actually created with this tool. And I think N7EKB, I think I saw him on the call, he wrote a successor tool for that in Python called CPS import builder. And it supports the same input formats and it supports more radio types. And then I'm a programmer professionally, so I had to take a whack at it as well. And I wrote my own generator here called DZCB. These are really nice because what they allow you to do, I'm going to stop sharing and switch to my, what am I going to switch to? What they allow you to do is download raw data from P&W Digital that's already in the correct format and then convert it into code plugs automatically. I'm about to show you what that data looks like. So can you see the Excel? So this is
Yep.
what we're dealing with. This file comes from P&W Digital, and they actually generate it automatically from their database. So this is the most up-to-date information about the P&W Digital DMR network. It has all the repeaters, frequencies, color codes, and then this is kind of a matrix of talk groups which are carried on that repeater and what time slot they're on. So the code plug generators I mentioned on the previous slide read this file and then will generate all of the channels for you. So each line here, this is like a single repeater, and the script will generate a channel for audio test because that one's carried. It'll generate a BC1, a bridge 2, a California. And so you don't have to create all those channels yourself. This will do it for all the repeaters automatically. And it's more complex for sure. And the input format, it's not point and click. You got to run scripts, you got to write CSV files, you got to get stuff in the right formats. But once you do that, it's much more maintainable long term, and it's easier to share this information with others. So N7EKB has been posting community code plugs that have been generated with his tool, which I'm sure are helping the community out there. And like I said, the community code plugs are created with the K7ABD tool. So this is how I would hope a lot of people end up using the network, because we have this data available and it's just not right to waste our human time copying this into various text boxes and stuff in every different CPS and hoping that you don't transpose a 9 or a 5 here or there. So that is the content that I have prepared, and I'm willing to delve into other topics or take questions on this or unrelated questions, or I can pull up my generated code plug and we can look at that and see how it works. So I'm open to whatever people are interested in seeing.
I'm going to have to play with the software a little bit, but I wanted to let you know I really appreciated the content you provided because it helped me to understand things better.
Good, I'm glad.
Yeah, thanks, Mason. This was a huge help. Just at a strategic level, I think what I'll probably do is play around and do it by hand a couple times, both analog and digital, just make sure everything's working and get the workflow. But as far as building up a code plug, I have a whole bunch of stuff already from the analog world, you know, that I've used tools like Chirp and other things,
Mm-hmm.
so that whether it's mobile or different handhelds, I have the same, you know, channel one's the same thing, you know, so I can interoperate really easily. What would you recommend if I was going to use it as a jumping off point? Like I want to append to my existing analog code plug, I guess, you know, because I can export those as CSVs, of course, have a bunch of that stuff. Should I use one of those tools that like your GitHub project or something like that? Or
Yeah, I think that would be probably the preferred way to approach it. Let me pull up that site. Ah, geez. I lost my browser. Stand by a sec. All right, so this is K7ABD's Anytone config builder. This is what they make the community code plugs out of. It's got reasonably good documentation. You can see like what the sample inputs look like. And that's not it, but yeah. So if you're used to Chirp, it's very similar stuff here. You got names and frequencies and stuff like that. You could definitely get an output from your programs that is in this format. And the main difference is these files have a zone so that when you put them in a DMR radio, they show up in a particular grouping. But certainly if you have CSV files, going generated is going to be a lot better, particularly if you are going to have more than one type of radio. You don't really want to manage code plugs manually. It's going to be a headache. Let me stop that and go back to the browser, because I also wanted to show in 7EKBs the CPS import builder, because I think this tool supports a better organization, so you can have an entire directory of files rather than having to combine them together. So this let you keep your channels separate based on what they are, and then the tool itself combines them when it generates the code plug. And you can see he already has quite a bit of channels of interest in here that you could already just use to make a code plug. And the documentation here is really quite good too. It goes over the input format and how it does the conversion process. I'm not willing to recommend my tool at this point because the documentation is not at the level that I'm willing to support. So for sure, check out the K7ABD. This is pretty easy. And then if you want a little more customization, CPS import builder is probably going to have you covered there.
Question.
that's really cool. Thank you very much.
I have a
Go ahead,
question,
Matt.
Jason. Will that Anytone builder work for the 578s, or is it specific for the 878s?
I don't know off the top of my head. You'd have to look at the documentation.
The reason I ask is because I have to use different software for the 878 and the 578.
Yeah, I mean, for the CPS import builder, it supports the 868 and the 878. I don't see 578 on here. I would suspect those are less common, but certainly, and I'm trying to check the participant list. I saw N70KB on here earlier. He still is. I'm sure he would be receptive to contributions and extending the tool to support more radios. It has basic support for the TYT, but I mean, the main reason I wrote my own generator is because this does not support zones at this point. So there's a couple manual steps you have to do there. All this stuff is growing. You know, it's the more people use it, the more people have feature requests, the more people find bugs, the better it's going to get for everybody. So I really think that generating code plugs is the way forward, because then is less likely to make mistakes. It's more repeatable and more customizable, really. It's less effort. What else are we looking at? So one thing I'll just show regarding what I'm doing with my setup, and this is not really out there yet. So I have this thing called DZCB, and the input file is this repeater book proximity CSV. So I open this thing up, and where'd it go? It's really annoying. I can't share my whole desktop. All right, so can you see the Excel with the city names and stuff? So what this is doing is going to repeater book, punching in these coordinates, and looking for repeaters within 35 miles of that. And band 14 is 2 meter, band 4 is 440. So I run this with my repeater book credentials, and then it spits out a bunch of files that could be read by my tool or by the CPS import builder. These are K7 ABD formatted files from repeater book. And so this is just fetched dynamically. So instead of having to even maintain all the repeaters and the frequencies and tones and stuff, we could just have a single source of truth on repeater book. And if the code plug's wrong, instead of fixing it in the code plug, you just fix it in the upstream on repeater book itself. Same story with the PNW digital data. If you get a PNW digital generated code plug and something's wrong, it's probably either a bug in the program or they have the settings in the C bridge wrong and need to get them fixed. So I think in that regard, having code plugs modified by individuals on the ground, we can't all share in that benefit. So having a upstream data source, pulling that down and generating this stuff, I think is helpful. All right. That's about all I got. I'm kind of tired of talking. So if anybody else has topics, we'll see what else comes out.
Well, Mason, I really appreciate all the trouble you've gone through to make this happen for us. You've taught us a lot, and it's very valuable. And once again, thank you very much.
Yeah, glad to share the knowledge.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
And
I
this
appreciate
is
it,
being
John, all the
recorded.
time.
Oh, who was that? Rick?
Oh, I said I appreciate all the time you put in. I know he did you spent a lot more than an hour prepping on it. And I appreciate you putting all the time in the public here too. That's what ham radio's for, helping each other out.
Absolutely. So I have recorded this presentation. I have the slides and written info and links to the software on my website. I will put the link in the chat again if anybody missed it the first time through. And once I get the video cut, I will upload it there as well.
I have a question about scan lists. How many frequencies or channels, depending on what type of data you have, how many do you have in a scan list? Because I know I've got 2 talk groups and the local 2.6 repeater, and between those two, I've got like 100 guys I'm trying to have conversations with. I don't have that many in my list. How many do you have that you actually use?
That's a good question. Let me look. So I have been experimenting with generating scan lists as well. And the main one I use is about 13 frequencies, I think. I scan a lot of repeaters though that don't have a lot of traffic on them. So if I go look at my main scan list, Poplar scan, this is the one I listen to when I'm sitting at home. Get Oregon 1, Washington 2, and because I have group lists set up on these, that allows me to monitor time slot 1 or time slot 2 traffic on the LVR repeater. I got nearby analogs, probably about 12 of those, and then I scan digital simplex, a couple of GMRS frequencies that my family uses, and 5.2. So were you counting? I think that's about 15.
No, I didn't count. I can see there's quite a few in there though. That is really handy that your radio will transceive in analog and digital. I've just got the 380, which is a very nice radio. Or what I meant to say was analog, digital, and UHF and VHF. Mine is simply UHF. It works very well, but I am missing a little bit of what I would like in there.
Yeah, I mean, you got yours used, so that's about the only reason I'd ever buy a 380 instead of a UV380, because they're the same price new now, and the firmware on the UV380 is good enough that you don't need the custom firmware for the MD-380. It's not really relevant for the UV. And the 3000 channels really makes a big difference. Like for example, just with generating the P&W digital data, no analog, no simplex, nothing, that's 1800 channels. You can't even fit it on your radio, even if you cut out all the VHF ones. So then you have to go in and decide what channels you actually, or what repeaters you care about. You're like, well, I don't go to Wenatchee very much, so I'll take that one out and never make it down to Yakima. So you have to make decisions like that.
Yes, I agree.
Which are, challenging. The thing I like about this code plug is, I got a zone for all of the repeaters, and I got zones for all these analog frequencies. And so when I'm traveling, I don't have to reprogram my radio. It's already just all there.
Uh-oh. I missed a little bit of what you said, Mason, because my computer froze up. I had to race and close a bunch of windows really quick.
I was just saying, with the 3000 channels, I have it basically programmed for all of Oregon and Washington, mostly the places I go, but I don't have to reprogram it. It's nice to always throw it in the truck and not have to worry about looking up frequencies. And particularly with these TYTs, they don't program on the front panel very well. You can do it, but it's a hassle. It doesn't really work.
It's not fun.
So having everything loaded in there before you leave is really, really critical.
I did read somewhere, I couldn't find it again, but I did read somewhere about DMR that these radios are designed to not be front panel programmable because they're a commercial radio.
I believe it. I mean, you can set a password to program it. You could also, I didn't show this in the slides, but you can go to menu items and you could turn on and off the items in the menu. So you can turn off program, don't let them control the backlight. You could disable these settings. I mean, for me, I turn them all on pretty much, but
yes, I agree.
You can like set passwords to program the thing. So it's clearly commercially for the commercial market, but they're so cheap and readily available,
and they work so well,
and they're solid. The thing is, it's heavy. It's good. It's a good rig, despite software shortcomings.
My first TYT that I got, I really hated it because I didn't understand it. I didn't have the education, the experience, so I got rid of it. And I got another one, and I'm starting to like it more.
This is my first DMR radio, so I just thought all DMR sucked until I got my wife an 878.
This is your first everything. You're a new ham.
Hey, Matt, who bought your radio?
What?
Hey, Matt, who bought your radio?
He's muffled. I can't understand him.
Matt, who bought your radio from you?
Who bought it from me? Oh, my first TYT went
Yeah, who got
to
your old?
Kai.
Okay.
Yeah.
It'd be funny if you got the same one back.
No, this one, well, I got another brand new one. I got this one from Ralph. All right, guys. Who dinged?
Hey, Matt, you got
Yeah.
the Ralph. I think I got the hacked firmware on that too.
It is. Yes. It's a very good radio.
Okay.
It works very well. Well, guys, I need to eat. So I really enjoyed this presentation. Once again, thank you, Mason. You did an outstanding job. Very impressed. I'm going to get out of here, guys.
Thanks.
It's good talking to you.
Stop the recording. We'll
listening.
shut it down.
Yep.
It's like the room's clearing out anyway.
Yep.
Thanks
Thanks
for
everyone
helping.
for coming, and we'll see you again.
Catch you guys later.